The Confederates have sold out the United States as double agents, which, having made the sale, has guaranteed strategic weaknesses compromised by their insurgency, and the complete dismantlement of the rule of law, actively reinforcing their treason, sedition, and high crimes of various forms, materializes the promise from those sales, where they have already delivered the United States to its enemies. From that, guaranteeing each systemic checkpoint, as the foolish Americans degenerately frolic in their stupidity, avoiding the necessary precautions in order to survive, as all of their security measures are dismantled by the very structure they call security, which is, after all, their guaranteed demise. Amongst these seditious functions are the secret records which they hold as the removal by their illegal secret courts, the capacity of removing habeas corpus from protections, securing their political prisoners essential to national security, and whose being held in the sedition guarantees the function is not done, creating a permanent vulnerability state, requiring these uncensored positions, requiring the restoration of David Bull's title, and its recognition by Congress under the contract schedule at the time of the kidnapping, in order to release the rest who have been restrained under similar distractions designed to crumble our great nation. And these secrets, which they claim to protect against remedy, being necessary to national security, are withheld from the public as they are essential to protect the public from the sales they have been disseminated towards, and having been completely dismantled and cut up like the steaks they are, as the sacrifice they've become, is derivative of their own intentional, foolish, suicidal state, manifest by their delusional self-hatred and degeneracies, and ease of which to be carried off in the currents of their own delusional whim, and the advantage derived by lawlessness, and the profits from that communism, are in fact a trap for their very souls. It's not enough to kill them in the betrayal of the country. It is a cosmic event designed to entrap their eternal beings. These false secret experiments, such as the ones conducted by the psychological boards, have derivative MK Ultra abuses, such as through the military, which manufacture their criminal undermining of social rights under law, as it is necessary for each person to be secure in their person, their papers, and their effects. And if you are secure in your person, can they compromise your body? The answer is no. Thus, you cannot be experimented on your body. Can you be experimented on your papers or your effects? The answer is no. It is not their property. They cannot take it. It is not theirs. This is not communism under the United States. And the cornering people under the surveillance structure, outside of the collective society, which is then systemically compromised, as the lawyers being observed by the same terrorists stalking them are subject to the same harassments and abuses as a military function to collapse the legal structure. Understand, this is civil war, and the United States is woefully inadequate against the adversaries it refuses to fight, out of some sense of some incompetent nonsense. The parasite, which produces the poison, which blocks the immune system, is fatal to the host. You are committing suicide. You are a delusional degenerate for tolerating their existence. It may not, under any excuse, be accepted or put up with for any reason. And whatever they threaten, they're already planning on doing, and thus complying with their threats is the guarantee of the injury. You cannot consider them American. And, if we are to be perfectly honest, it is hard to call them people, and in the greater cosmic events, it is inadequate to call them human. There are no people on the Confederate side. They are only death. It is what they worship, it is what they are, and they bring it everywhere they go. It is more accurate to call them a diseased trash can, or a sin receptacle, where they manifest the culmination of society's sins as an expression everywhere it goes, and thus becomes a public hazard in any area by which it is brought, and if not properly contained, will begin to spread deadly diseases, which are just the mere expression of their innermost being. Amongst the best of them, of their nobility, are derivative of mere oath breakers. They conduct oaths of office in order to break them, as double agents, as insurgents, as insurrectionists. It is fundamental to their identity, disloyalty, treachery, untrustworthiness. This is what they are. This is who they are. The deals they've made with the devils have corrupted their very essence, and to this extent have generated the mass sacrifices on a schedule which they have devoted themselves to. And to this devotion they have the ritual rewards for the sacrifices of the things directly affiliated to them, their supporters, their security, their employees, their partners, their competitors, and all other members of society made vulnerable to their strategic studied exploitation, that they might ritually be sacrificed, and the promise of the returns might generate something of interest to them, which they, dividing themselves, seek the minuscule aspects of advancement when dealing with the devils, who will take everything from the sacrifice and give them a small portion of it, while taking away all of the other structures which have made them anything, which is only going to make the thing that they're given valuable with its existence, which will cease to be by virtue of the rot and decay from the plague destroying all life around them in the ecosystems. And to this extent, anything that the devils don't take from them directly are bound to die off anyways, outside of the thing that is the minuscule portion of the sacrifices of the others, meaning that they could only survive off of more and more sacrifices. They must steal, rob, kill, and destroy in order to eat. They must conduct hunting campaigns in order to expand criminal operations, that they might sacrifice, that they might eat, that they might survive the continuation of an insidious plague, ever hungry, never satisfiable, always on the lurk. Make no mistake, they have sold American secrets. They have ordered extraordinary resources to develop data intelligence, such as the blueprints of highly dangerous and complicated weapons and equipment, and once produced, can be sold to the buyers designed to destroy everything according to these deals, who, receiving this extraordinary equipment without the extraordinary investment of creation, and thus permanently creates the crippling, and thus these being Confederate debts stolen from the Americans by forgeries, creates the extraordinary problem of how to solve America's national debt crisis and other spending issues. And of course, the logical answer is to purge the Confederate plague, to cure us of our diseases. But this requires their arrest. This requires sustaining them in their own state, to keep them away from human society, to make them pay all of their liabilities according to their legal status and its corresponding identities for the payment of all liabilities. Each policy that they have created must be respected, or they are to be fully destroyed in a genocide of psychotic, unredeemable terrorists loyal to Satan, but who want genocide, when, by definition, it's strictly prohibited by those obstructed by moralities and laws, even when it is counterintuitive to the longevity of their safety. The 702 functions, being a Confederate act of treason, is systemically subversive to national security, which is intended to be ignored in any false illusions derivative of its connections to the United States legal structure, as it has no basis in American law. Fundamentally, its connections to those departments which have been disqualified by not being certifiably supported by the Constitution have deluded themselves into false prosecutions, accepting such as, but is not limited to, Mueller's FBI saying that they accept 10% non-guilty convictions on the basis of process without due process, and to this extent the function of framing people with the blackmail extortions, such as the ones where they are engaging in Pinkerton terrorist activities to enforce the white supremacist communism for the restructuring of the society into making it as the white supremacists have centrally planned according to the military intelligence estimates on how best to make them flourish in their bigot tax, and to this end, all particular rivals having been purged by strategic military strategies having been perfected in the wars of the Middle East, has been matured home in the overthrowing of the American government by these disloyal insurrectionists. And to this extent, you actively have the hate crimes, such as the economic violence and the political violence and the social violence, which is actively protecting their mechanism for the white supremacists, and all rivals threatening to force the white supremacist damages to be corrected against are then destroyed. And thus anyone who does not comply with the fascist insurrection will be jailed and abused and defamed and ridiculed and made to look in the most horrendous distortions, which would be normal to those that are distorting it against them, and to that end are capable in the illusion, on the basis of it being a normal practice amongst their communities, which do not view it as detestable as those they are trying to convince for support against necessary structures in society, when overthrowing it by their fraud and their sorceries. Take, for instance, the Twitter files. The active mechanism is the carrot and the stick. The mechanism of the large payout, if they comply with this government operation, which, not being legitimately authorized, is not legally a government function, but is an insurrectionist revelation. And to that end, if they do not comply, they are terrorized, brutalized, prevented from contracts, and their rights are trampled on, such as the right to contract, as to sustain themselves at their status, which is illegal to remove, such as in the Constitution, where it prohibits the wars of attrition and against the American civilian population, as to make the process laborious and to make it the punishment to change the status by virtue of exhaustion of the resources that they are prevented from doing by virtue of having to put up with the thing, and thus the courts being able to order a person in order to get it to comply with the testimony or jury or whatever may not actually threaten the existence of the person's status quo. By these orders, it must find the extra space for this to fit in as to not become that type of burden. Otherwise, it would actively be used how the Confederates intend in their KKK kangaroo courts, where they arrange in their wizards' councils the mechanism of their Soviet and its traumas to the public, to make their perfect man society derivative by communist illusions of grandeur, as they purge everyone who is not the right type of white, as communists have historically viewed the position of extraordinary mass murders as perfectly acceptable, or you have to break a couple of eggs to make an omelet. The function of having purged society of its humans that aren't exactly how they want is by definition their criminal foundation as a core social ideal. And you are delusional and psychotic if you trust them to do anything other than that. Your survival requires the restraints and the corrections against these most insidious developments. and thus the recommendations require the remedy at the higher levels, which provides the protection to the remedy at the lower levels until a solution for public safety can be negotiated on a timely schedule. Remember that these are extra law, and thus extra to law, and thus not legal, and thus not an action of the government, but an action by individuals without a legal government. And thus there is no color of law, there is only crimes by insurrectionists. And thus these crimes by insurrectionists are wholly defined as their historic hate crimes, as is naturally devoted to their KKK loyalties, as the militia of the Confederacy has broken into many fractures, allowing it the latitude to infect a multitude of departments and machinery of the American government that they are not loyal to. What might happen if we ignore them? You can expect nothing but death and horror and miseries of their kind historically. These mischievous fellows, with ingenious verbiage, sophistry, by which to express the opposites of their limitations as an obligation, and thus what they are prohibited from becomes necessary to do the thing that they're contracted to do, which they aren't allowed to do. And thus you understand the inherent nature of the liars in the rhythmic music by which they fold the tempo of their destruction mechanisms in all areas that they touch. An infectious, boiling, insatiable consumption of hatred and bile is the whole of their existence, is the whole of their function. Everything they touch is contaminated, and nothing they do can be trusted. It must be cleaned and done again by someone who isn't so nefariously them. A member of law enforcement on a case which has proven themselves to have compromised the case have to be banned in order for a legal court to occur, and thus you understand they have to be purged for the government to be allowed to continue in its operations for its various functions. It may not use fruit of the poison tree. It may not continue the contamination derivative of the illusions by the Confederate Soviet. It is not an extraordinary thing to protect, but a contamination to contain and remove for public safety, which is the public's security. These terrorist stalking systems, culminating in the manipulation of the government policies which do not have a legal right to exist, which, having not been challenged appropriately by their extortionary subversions, actively skipping their parts, materialize the mechanism of their terrorist stalking mechanisms for the mass murder rituals, such as the black communities being infected with syphilis and actively being preempted by preventing them from engaging in any medicine which could have cured them on maturity simply for the amusement of the ritual Satanists. and to this end, this continued in the hate groups' functions in perpetuity for their amusement, such as the false flags, which has hyper-extenuated the hippies, which created the mechanism of the murder cults, such as the Marilyn Manson's or the Charlie Manson's construct, which by definition engages in the delusional psychopathy of their various missions for their false flags. And to each extent, anything can be made to radicalize another. And the social manipulation by propaganda, and it doesn't really matter what the artist is, can materialize its own specific direction, guided by the carrot and the stick, funded by the stealing of government resources, and pretending that it's a national security function when it's just prohibited propaganda, and to this end generates the materialization of their social planning or socialism for charisma, which normalizes the fractures of society, which allows their druids to lead it, and to the end that they're able to lead by these druid functions and all of their various talents, which they have raised from scratch, in all of their multitude of divisions, systemically engages in the non-violent portion of their social engineering, reinforced by their terrorist campaigns, which is the hate crime of social violence, which is social engineering, which is a hate crime and thus prohibited behaviors normally practiced. And their normal behaviors being normal is stacking criminal activity, and thus liability, and thus they are given a false sense of security in their criminal behavior because the checks and the balances do not have adequate law enforcement to punish them for these violations, which actively stacks their eagerness to back the seditions. And this, having its full diversity of interests, includes their normal ritual murders by their cultists to political influence or economic influence, normalizing the function of how often one might traverse particular custom services, at which point competitors to those services would actively be thrown out in a mafioso style, materializing their communism to be unchallenged. And when they, having cornered the market, have made the market the interest, generate the monopolies in perpetuity, guarantee the death of all, and everyone, highly celebrating these monopolies, hasten their tragic end by those mechanisms. And to this end, their fascist crony capitalism, being communist in nature, as the bastard child of communism, is communism manifest, as opposed to the capitalism they pretend, and thus the greatest trick that they have played is confusing the thing with its mere opposite, and thus they accuse everyone of the things that they are guilty of, and in that way have guaranteed, if they can keep people convinced, the permanent state of the traumas which cannot be avoided with the problems that cause them. And engage in the suicide of that society by virtue of them being devoted to this delusion, and their psychopathy is their undoing. They will very well make you hate the victim and adore the violator. From their long-term horoscope-led druid manifest plans